Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8 podcast. This is Emma Weinheimer, and today Dr. Josh Hochschild and I are going to be interviewing Professor Stephen McGinley, a Mount graduate and professor of philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Great to be here, Emma.
Professor McGinley, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and either areas of expertise or things that you particularly like to study?
Happy to, yes. I am a Mount graduate in 2010. I'm from Hagerstown originally, one of 6 kids, and my father was a Mount graduate, and my grandfather on my mother's side is a Mount graduate. So when I was here, I was one of 9 at the point to have come through the Mount, and now since then 4 others, 2 by marriage, or 3 by marriage, actually. So happy Mount graduate and a sort of product of the core. I then went to the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at Catholic University of America in D.C. to get a Master's of Theological Studies in Marriage and Family. So basically, when I was at the Mount, my BS was in economics, and I took as many other courses as seemed interesting, many of which were philosophy courses. And then in my master's focused on sort of the church's teaching on creation and redemption vis-a-vis marriage and family. And so you had to know marriage as a sacrament, and since it's a sacrament, how it presupposes and perfects the sort of natural institution of marriage, and also Catholic anthropology, as it were, in light of John Paul II's pontificate. And then my wife and I, well, I'll make a long story short. Essentially, I then was a youth minister for 3 years after about a year of underemployment. And then we sold everything and went to buy a farm. Bought a farm and taught as an adjunct at the Mount. And then the Mount hired me full-time as a lecturer in the philosophy and symposium program.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're all over the place.
I am all over the place.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So the symposium at its best is an introduction to the Catholic intellectual tradition through the Catholic anthropology. It's also an onboarding for how to not fail college.
Yeah.
And how to flourish as a human being in college, and also how to write like a college student should, which means to say how to think well, and then when you can think well, to write well and speak well. And so getting the students to reflect on what it means to be human through great texts that are not philosophical texts primarily.
No, I think that's really well put. I mean, it's an ambitious class that's trying to do a lot, but it is essentially the gateway class to a liberal arts education and to an integrated core. And in that, it embodies the Catholic vision of the person and uses great texts to both raise the questions that we want students to ask, but also give them the kind of touchstones that they can formulate answers in reference to.
Right, exactly. And then the farm sort of is the way that the word becomes flesh vis-a-vis creation. It was how I would argue it, but the podcast today isn't about that.
I was gonna say, that sounds like it could be a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
And actually, from the way that you explain the symposium class, that sounds very much like what we're trying to accomplish with this podcast project. Because some of the texts that we have been discussing are philosophical texts, but we have also brought in other texts from the English discipline and from politics that might not necessarily be on your standard giant shelf of quote-unquote great books. All right, so we're going to be talking about Beowulf and Song of Roland. Can you tell us a bit about the context of these 2 individual texts?
Sure, yeah. So first, I'll give my context for the 2 individual texts, because to me, that matters more, and that's not really, it doesn't, but in terms of its history. But I was first introduced to the Song of Roland as a Mount student in what at the time was the Renrev, or the first integrated sequence back in 2006. And the Song of Roland is a story about Roland, who's a soldier under Charlemagne's army. Well, I'm not a scholar, so I love the Song of Roland and Beowulf. Beowulf is written, my sense is somewhere between the 10th and 12th centuries, is my understanding, but I could be mistaken, and Sean-Lewis could totally correct. And probably will after he listens to this. But the long and short of it is, for me, the introduction to the Song of Roland was part of my Mount education. I don't remember the context, the historical context, so it was probably given. What I remember is that it was an excellent human story about what it means to be human, which I'll say more about in a little bit. I first read Beowulf as an adult to my 2-year-old son 6 years ago because he liked dragons. And I remembered that Beowulf had a dragon in it. So I read it to him. And then because it ended with a dragon, we thought, and Raphael was into knights and stuff like that. We then went from Beowulf to The Hobbit, and then to The Lord of the Rings, and then
Naturally.
Chronicles of Narnia, and then other great books. Raphael is extremely...
He's a very well-read 8-year-old.
Yes. He loves a good story.
What type of work are these? Are they epic poems?
Yeah, so Beowulf is my understanding again is it's the oldest English epic poem. And it's, I guess it would be Old English, like beyond Old English.
It's a form of Old English that can't
Older
just like pick
than
up
you.
and read. It's a different language. It's very Germanic.
Exactly. We have a text, one of my texts that we use for Raphael has the Old English with the modern English. And I have no idea what I would even be trying to read in the Old English. The Song of Roland is an epic poem also, and it's structured in that epic style, right, where there's sort of a narrative with a repetition and a narrative with a repetition, which is a very liturgical way of structuring a document.
Was that written in French?
Yes, originally, yeah. The translation we have is a Penguin edition.
You're being kind of modest. Truthful, right? You're not a scholar of these works. But I think that actually models something really valuable for us, not just on the podcast, but at Mount St. Mary's. I mean, we have faculty who are scholars and specialists, but even so, they aren't necessarily always teaching their specialty, right? At any small liberal arts college, most of the faculty members teaching is something that they are really actually doing as an amateur, because you know, even when you specialize in something very small, very, very narrow. And we want to model to our students that you don't have to be a specialist to get something out of these books. And in fact, that it might actually be easier to appreciate what these books have to offer if you haven't filled your mind with all the kinds of technical stuff that it takes to write a dissertation on it, right? So I love that your authority on Beowulf is that you read it to your son and he loved it. That's impressive.
Yeah,
that's impressive.
Right.
Yeah.
He loved it so much, we've actually read it multiple times now. I think the last time we read it was last winter, if my memory is correct. And so Miriam now, my daughter, we have Raphael, who's 8, Miriam's 5. Miriam liked it. We first read Song of Roland when we came back to the mountain. I was teaching again, and we were living at the Toll House. And it was winter, and so I'm a farmer. So in the summer, sort of reading takes a hiatus, the nighttime reading, because it's light until 9 and I have farm work to do until 9. But in the winter, when it's dark, we read. We don't have a TV, so we don't waste our time with that. We do have a projector if we want to watch a good movie, but that's rare because it takes effort to put up the projector and we're lazy. Whereas reading a book requires just opening a book. So we read the Song of Roland. Miriam was probably 2. Raphael was, I guess, like 5, maybe 6. The Song of Roland, one of the things I love about the Song of Roland is it's politically incorrect. It is absolutely politically incorrect, which is why we should make students read it, because it busts their assumptions about what literature should look like. It's not sterilized. And when I say that it's politically incorrect, I mean, it's very much a Christian novel that is violent. Charlemagne and Roland are fighting the infidel, right? And it's this glorious battle against the Moors who have invaded, but it's also a tragedy, right? Roland dies in the end. Raphael and Miriam, all I remember is them running around yelling "Manjoie," which is the sort of French call to arms. My joy is what I take it to mean. It's my joy to serve the king, right, and to die on his behalf. Roland and it's sort of like Battle of Thermopylae-esque in that Roland and his group take the rear guard of Charlemagne's army when they leave. And the battle sort of revolves around them holding the pass and all of the heroic courage that goes into that, but also the sort of hubris that Roland has. He doesn't blow the horn soon enough. His best friend says to Roland, "We should blow the horn, Roland." And Roland says, no, we have time still. And it ends up being like, that is the pivotal moment at which they don't actually have time. And Roland blows the horn too late. Charlemagne hears the horn. He comes back and avenges their death. But in the meantime, Roland and his friend and his entire army has been essentially decimated. For Beowulf has really, it's three stories in one. There's the first story is with Grendel, which is the first monster that comes to Heorot and kills people viciously in the night. Beowulf first comes to Hrothgar to help out, essentially solve this problem that his men are getting killed. And he pretends to be asleep. When Grendel comes to sort of eat him, Beowulf just rips his arm off him. Then Grendel goes back, and then Grendel goes and bleeds to death. And then Grendel's mother has Grendel's arm down in her lair.
Right near her weapons, I think.
Grendel's mother then comes back. She starts causing trouble in the neighborhood, and Beowulf hunts her down and kills her in a really epic battle that Raphael and Miriam both love. And then you have this sort of peacetime, and then you have Beowulf's fight with a dragon. He takes with him 12 soldiers, all of whom are hand-selected to be the best, and then all of whom betray him except one. Beowulf gives this sort of speech before they go into the dragon to fight the dragon that's very much the sort of Last Supper discourse. And then his one disciple or his one soldier gives this other rousing speech that calls to task the other 11 who fled, and it is awesome. And it's as Beowulf fights the dragon by himself, but is totally getting pwned. And this other soldier goes to aid him, but the other soldier can't really help. And it ends up being that Beowulf kills the dragon, but is mortally wounded and then dies. And the other 12 are sort of chastised that if they hadn't abandoned, Beowulf might not have died. There's also, again, in terms of the love of epics, there is a great epic song that's about 7 minutes long by Frank Forrester that is called The Ballad of Beowulf, that if you've not listened to, I really strongly recommend. I emailed Frank Forrester. I found him on YouTube, creepily stalking, and found his email somehow, I don't remember how, and asked him for the lyrics, but also for him to transpose it into my vocal range so that I could learn to sing it. When I was a youth minister, there was a girl who was an expert pianist for the youth ministry plays that I did, that she mastered it so that she could play alongside me. We have a recording of it. But it's an epic song. It's 7 minutes, and you go through Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. And it's the musical notation. Frank Forrester did an exquisite job, I think. My sense is that both Beowulf and the Song of Roland have at their core human questions, namely, why am I here? In Beowulf, it's debated among scholars, right, whether there are Christian elements. I think there are obvious Christian elements. I'm not a scholar, but my read on what I have read of some of the scholars' critiques of the Christianity in Beowulf is that it's too sort of violent loving. Frankly, I have no problems with that. It seems to me very in line with the Old Testament. It totally flies against the 20th century's mindset where violence is deeply problematic and we're not used to violence because people don't die around us anymore, at least not in America. Before the sort of wonders of modern medicine, when people died with great frequency and Vikings could come into your village and rape, steal, and pillage everything, and you have no means of defense, aside from like your sickle, the sort of lived life was more violent, is my sense. Now, again, I'm not a scholar, but it seems to me there's a way of reading Beowulf that's totally in accord with a deeper Christian conception, which is that providence is what leads Beowulf to help Hrothgar and Heorot, right? And that this providence manifests itself, that Beowulf is gifted, singularly gifted, to be able to resolve a problem, right? So you have the sense of vocation, but that Beowulf needs community also to support that.
Was Beowulf connected to Hrothgar in any way prior to his coming there?
Yeah, so there is
something about him coming because his men were dying.
My sense is that there's some sort of ancient lineage between Beowulf and the king at Heorot.
So there's not a direct one.
It's not like Beowulf is the son of the king. Beowulf is an outsider coming in.
It's not obvious, and it almost seems sort of out of the blue.
Yeah.
He doesn't owe it to the hall. It's not his hall.
Right.
And he was a known hero from elsewhere, so the hall is glad to have him ally with them and come and defend them. I don't know if it's clear at all.
He wasn't asked to
why
come.
He does.
There's no like, hey, I'm sending you a letter. Please come save us because we're all getting killed. He just sort of like comes across the sea.
Okay, so that actually seems to fit even more deeply and beautifully into the idea of vocation. If there was he didn't owe them anything.
No.
And if he just kind of happened to stumble upon that and still yet had that calling to defend them. Yeah,
there's a total sense, it seems to me, there's a sense of gratuity built into Beowulf that is a totally, in my read, a Christian gratuity. The people of Heorot don't deserve Beowulf. Beowulf doesn't owe them anything. It's not a matter of justice, freely. Right? But it's a matter of mutual thanksgiving, right? Mm-hmm. That Beowulf is like, hey, I'm here, I'm awesome, and I'm going to kill this monster that's killing your people. And they're like, yes, thank you. So they throw a huge party, after which everyone falls asleep. And one of Beowulf's men actually gets eaten.
What kind of monster is Grendel? In a lot of other stories where there is some sort of monstrous enemy, there's often like a clear account of why it is an enemy. And also even some clear symbolism about like what sort of enemy it is, right? So the Cyclops only has one eye and it's limited in what it can see and understand, and it's selfish. Or the dragon has a kind of long history of traditional symbolism around it. Grendel seems to be like its own kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure what Grendel looks like or how big Grendel is. For a while I imagined like a Jabba the Hutt kind of figure, but that doesn't seem to do justice to it. What is motivating Grendel to sack the hall?
Right.
And also, what is the kind of monster that Grendel is? Like, what is that supposed to say? And maybe that's too much of like an English teacher question. Like,
no, I think
what is the representation? Maybe it doesn't have to have that. Maybe there's something wrong with my question. But
calm down.
I love English professors. I'm just saying that sometimes we're taught to read things by imposing questions on them that aren't the ones that the text is actually inviting. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe Grendel doesn't represent something.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me the physical description has a sort of nebulousness.
Yeah,
that I think is probably fitting for the character. Right? We know that he comes from the sea or from this like lake thing because that's where his mother is. I think you could make the case that it's an exegesis and not an eisegesis, right? That it's actually drawing out from the text, not putting something in, that Grendel represents bloodlust and this consumption with the desire for violence, because that's all Grendel wants. He rejoices in violence for its own sake. Grendel is, in a sense, enslaved by his own bloodlust, right? His own passions. He requires this in order to be what he is. One of the things I love about Beowulf is that Grendel has a mother.
Also seems strange, right?
Yes.
Because at first you think Grendel is just this lonely beast who hates community, and so he's maybe envious of the joy and celebration of the hall, and so that's what's motivating his destruction. And then he wants to go back and lurk alone, but he's not alone.
Right,
he's a mama's boy.
He's a mama's boy. He's not even like with his. I was saying he's not even like with a male relative. It's funny that you're joking about that he's a mama's boy. I always thought that was interesting that it was his mother that came to avenge him rather than like his male cousin or his brother or his dad or his uncle.
Yeah, and I
One
think
of these people.
I think it's telling that it's his mother. There's no beauty in the description of the mother, except insofar as she's mother. It's surmised in the epic that Grendel is the offspring of Grendel's mother and something very evil. But again, it's nebulous. It's not Satan. It's not. It doesn't come out and say, "Well, the devil is the one who's behind Grendel and Grendel's mother." That would be too easy. There's something. It's more complex, which I think again gets at Beowulf as a humanizing text, right? That evil has an origin, but that the origin is more complex than we want it to be. Beowulf has a father. Grendel doesn't. And Grendel only has a mother. And so there's a sense in which it seems to me you could make the argument, right, that part of what's going on in Beowulf is that our origins of relation matter.
At least this much seems right to me. The extent to which a lineage is described and there's only a partial family for Grendel is a suggestion that there's both something natural and unnatural about him. There is something that we can empathize with, but that we also want to recognize as unhealthy. He's a natural creature of some sort, but lives underwater or in a swamp or a lake or whatever it is. He has a mother, as you say, but we don't understand if he has a father and if he doesn't have siblings, apparently, too. So like you could argue there's something
One was his mother.
That's natural, but it's also unnatural, right? To be alone. It's not clear that there are neighbors or other. Is there any sort of society of these weird swamp creatures? We don't know that either.
Yeah.
So it's an evil force, but it's an evil force that we can somehow identify with because he's a son.
Exactly.
And he lives somewhere.
Right.
And they have a home, but it's not a comfortable home, and it's a home that's not a part of a community. It's a family that's not really a family. And all of that does seem to be part of the design of this monster. And
I think in the sort of ancient sense, it would be more like the sort of reflection on widowhood would be how I would see it. Insofar as the Israelites were constantly reminded to take care of widows and orphans, which means that you need to be constantly reminded, means that there's the tendency to forget. I'm going to bring in Brave New World because I teach symposium and I love that text. Linda's a sort of monster from both the Malpace narrative and the World State narrative.
Linda
is John the Savage's mother.
Oh, okay.
She was the mother on the reservation in a time when motherhood is itself a shocking, profane idea.
Right. Huxley describes Linda and John the Savage as living outside the community and not really being a part, and that Linda was looked at as gross and
because she gave birth naturally.
Well, not in Malpace. In Malpace, that's not the issue. Linda is gross because to the women of Malpace, because she's a paramour. She has no issues having sex with everyone. The women don't like that. The men are totally fine with it. In both the Malpace narrative and in the World State narrative, it's the women who question polygamy. It's the men who are okay with it. In Malpace, you have the women who are upset with Linda for having sex with their husbands. And in the World State narrative, you have these key conversations between Lenina and Fanny, where both of them have to reassure one another and reaffirm that they should be promiscuous. Lenina says to Fanny, "Don't you ever feel like not being promiscuous?" And Fanny says, "Yes, but one's got to go on making the effort."
I want to get back to the Linda, John Grendel mother parallel, because I've never thought of that before. Yeah. And it's one of the nice advantages of reading great text together is these serendipitous. I mean, and nobody could claim that was intentional. I guess it's possible that Huxley had Beowulf in mind, right? But probably not. But it doesn't matter because as readers, we can see interesting commonalities. So draw that out for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, right, there's a sense you could make the connection. Again, whether Huxley conceived it or not doesn't really matter. When Linda comes back to the World State, Linda is seen as gross. Everyone laughs at her because she's this blubberous, disgusting mess that's burnt and has missing teeth and is like wearing dead animals. When she walks in, everyone laughs at first, and then it's revealed that this is mother. And there's this silence because that's a profane word. You can't say mother. And she comes running into Tomakin, which is John the Savage's father, who left Linda in Malpace because he didn't go looking for her. Anyway, but then I think John the Savage would be a fun way to look for a connection, insofar as when we're first introduced to John, there's this human sacrifice going on in Malpace. And Lenina, who I would argue is one of the key characters who's humanized throughout Brave New World, but that's a whole nother argument. Lenina says to John, "You mean you wanted to be the one whipped?" And John says, "Yes, for the sake of the pueblo, to make the rain come and the corn grow, to please Jesus and Pukong, and to show how strong I am," right? To show that I could let my blood, that I could be whipped many times and to let my blood flow. And there's this sense, it seems to me, insofar as the blood is this sort of life force, Grendel is consuming the life force of humanity. He's sort of parasitic on the community. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, it seems to me, Brave New World, the novel, whether Huxley intended it or not, Brave New World, the novel, is asserting that human sacrifice, as well as the orgy-porgy, which Huxley clearly has in mind that the two are very similar. He makes it very clear in many narrative fashions, right? They have similar words, similar juxtapositions. In the orgy-porgy, Clara Detering says, she screams as though she's having her throat cut. The same phrase is used in the Malpace narrative, that the women scream as though they're having their throat cut or as though they're being killed. There's this same sort of ecstatic death going on. But it seems to me on a deeper level, right, what Brave New World is asserting, similar to Beowulf, this isn't bringing about human flourishing, that this is parasitic upon human flourishing. Because we have no clear idea of our origin, for Malpace, they're confused as to what to worship. In Brave New World, they're also confused as to what to worship. Both Malpace and the world state reject being as gift. The Malpace narrative is that human sacrifice is what makes the corn grow. By our action, we will make the god do what we want. And in that sense, that is the total rejection of being as gift, of gratuity. We are in charge. We will make the gods act how we want. In the similar way, the world state's rejection of being as gift, we see in the whole way of operating as a citizen is to move away from the order of creation, which exudes being as gift, right? It can't help it. And we see this particularly in chapter 4, where Lenina and Henry Foster are closed off from the natural world, from the moon and the stars, because those are depressing facts. And they sort of build up a wall, Huxley says, between them and the natural world through Soma, and then between them and the natural world and the nature of their own sexuality through Soma and contraception. He juxtaposes the two beautifully. In that sense, being is rejected as a gift, in the sense in which seeing the world as a sort of thing for me to use doesn't bring about human flourishing. And in that way, I think Grendel demonstrates the same reality, that insofar as we lack a shared recognition that our being is a gift as such from a giver who is good, Grendel also, it's unclear as his origin. Is his origin good? Does he see himself as a gift? Clearly not.
You could extend that even further, right? Because it's significant that Grendel wants to come and consume human flesh, right? But he doesn't just pick farmers out of the field, or go to any random family. It's the hall, which is a site of celebration. In the evenings when they are celebrating. So it's precisely a feast that has to be consumed, but illicitly. He doesn't want to join the feast. He wants to destroy the feast and deny its right to be a celebration. It's a place where they celebrate, they drink mead, and they are happy warriors together. Right. And it's a home, but it's a home as a place for the community to celebrate together. And that's what Grendel is breaking up. And that's why Beowulf is a hero for restoring it, right? Because it's not just for saving lives. It's for saving celebration.
This is a sort of argument in favor of both the human and the Christian sense of Beowulf, right? Christianity presupposes and perfects what is deeply human, and that celebration is something central to what it means to be human. And when we don't have it, we cannot flourish.
I was wondering if we could maybe talk a little bit about Song of Roland.
Yeah, in terms of Song of Roland, part of the narrative of Song of Roland is actually the restoration of Christendom. from the Moors, and the restoration of Christendom precisely for the restoration of celebration, for the restoration of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And in that sense, I think there's a sort of natural segue in that part of what both of these stories are about is the fight to maintain the holy things, the things that perfect human persons. The Song of Roland begins with this conversation between Charlemagne and his best knights about what should we do. One of the knights is a traitor. You have this traitor amidst them who's working for the Muslims, for the Moors. And
I presume we find that out eventually, but do we start?
It's right from the beginning. There's sort of there's no veil in the Song of Roland. It's great, which is one of the reasons I love it, right? Which is why I can read it to my kids. There's a sense in which there's a clear good and bad.
And that doesn't mean there can't be temptation or different kinds of strengths or manifestations of good and evil.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear right from the beginning that this guy is sneaky and a ne'er-do-well, and that Roland doesn't trust him. And it's clear from the beginning that Roland is awesome, and that Roland is like the most faithful servant to Charlemagne possible. It's clear from the beginning that Roland's friend is a faithful friend of Roland, that there's no sense of treachery going on there. And the traitor basically wins the argument and misleads Charlemagne into doing this against the will of some of the other thinkers or interlocutors. They go and they engage in this battle, and then as they're leaving, Roland stays behind to protect his king and everyone else. The traitor by this time has left, right, and gone to the other side and said, this is what's going to happen. Roland is going to be in the back. You can flank them, and it will be easy picking, because by that point, Charlemagne will be far enough away that he won't be able to get there effectively, and you're going to be able to play off of Roland's pride. He's not going to call the horn. But one of the characters is a bishop, and the bishop is a warring bishop, which is
Interesting.
But he's a warring bishop sort of from a distance. So there's clear that there's already this tension about, like, should bishops really be cleaving the heads off of infidels, et cetera, et cetera. There's already this sort of tension, but at this point, he does do his fair share. But there's conversations between Roland and the bishop and Roland's friend as to how do we respond to this. And there's a clear sense that the bishop's role is as the one who has the spiritual authority and is the one who's sort of in charge of celebration in the richest sense. And so there's a mutual calling of each other to courage, to defend the freedom of the Franks for celebration of the Mass. That we have to sacrifice ourselves for the church, and that this is a noble thing to be doing. And the bishop is there sort of, yes, it is our role as Christians to lay down our lives for the protection of the mission of the church. And in that sense, I see a connection with Beowulf and the need for celebration. What the goal that Charlemagne has is to restore the celebration of the sacraments more broadly and to advance, albeit by the blade, promulgation of the holy things. Obviously, as moderns, we might look at that and go, oh, poo-poo, right? There's a great book by Chesterton called The Ball and the Cross.
Yes.
You have these two characters.
You have a Catholic and then you have an atheist.
Yeah. Basically, they travel the world trying to duel each other over whether God's existence is a question that even matters, and no one will let them fight. And there's a sense, like, Chesterton is obviously making fun of us and modernity, but there's a sense in which we read Roland and we go, wow, these people are so vicious. At least they cared enough to fight for something, to defend the church, to defend that Christ matters. Now, all we care about spreading is like McDonald's.
Yeah, and there seems to be a very big difference from the reasons why the Franks were fighting in Song of Roland versus why whatever their names were in The Ball and the Cross. In Song of Roland, there's a sense of, you mentioned defending celebration and reclaiming that for yourself.
Yeah.
But in The Ball and the Cross, and even in modernity, I would argue, like, it seems like more of a matter of pride. When you're fighting in that way, it's I don't want to lose and I don't want you to win. So I'm going to annihilate you so that the guy with the bigger stick wins.
Yeah. The ball and the cross, the way that it ends, I'm not going to tell you because if you actually listen to the podcast, it's worth reading on your own. And the end is a surprise. The way that it's framed is essentially this constant seeking of a duel ends up becoming the opportunity for dialogue, for real dialogue. And that brings about an encounter of love in the strangest of situations that ends up opening up each other to see the true, the good, and the beautiful more richly, I would argue. And I'll just leave it at that.
I'm reflecting on the dynamic of this conversation and how really fascinating it's been. Well, no, but it's been a wonderful example. I mean, we started by noting that Professor McGinley started reading some of these books at Mount St. Mary's, which is beautiful to think that it started him down this path of thinking about books, and also appreciating the fact that the books that were chosen for the topic of discussion were not something that are the subject of some deep academic research, but just books that you love and have been a part of you and your family and your children and all of that. But then even our conversation about it has connected those books to other books, right? So Brave New World and Chesterton, and that also is a great example of how people who start reading great books start thinking of them together, and then it becomes a whole world and a way to process thoughts. And the next great book that you read, you then think of in light of what you've read in the past, and then those books give you the resources to venture forth into. I think it's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
And it definitely seems like they also like help you interpret your own experiences now.
Yeah, right. An ignorance of great texts leads to an ignorance of the texts that you currently read and of the films that you currently watch. Because those texts aren't in a vacuum. And movies are texts, they're narratives. The people who are making the movies, if they're a good movie and worth watching, are in a tradition and pull from that tradition in ways that surprise you. If it's a good movie, it's dealing with the human question. And in dealing with the human question, it's dealing necessarily with the question of cosmology and theology also. But in proposing an answer to that question, or at least in posing the question, it's necessarily in community with every other text that has posed that question. And so you can make viable connections between texts. Whether the author deliberately did it or not is somewhat irrelevant, but I would also submit that many times the authors deliberately make connections or try to, if they are at all reflective.
Absolutely. I mean, it's possible to be genuinely inspired, and many artists are, and so they strike on themes and ways of portraying things all on their own without having intentionally connected them. But it's also often the case. I mean, to be an artist is also to practice a craft. And artists who are serious about their craft want to know how other great artists have done it and want to be in conversation with them. And so there are often intentional allusions. So if I can connect even more meta threads of this conversation, right? One of the things that we're describing is how the reading of literature or even the viewing of culturally significant films in community is one of the ways that we use leisure, and one of the ways
that's why movie nights are so fun.
One of the ways that we celebrate together. And in a way, a liberal arts education is a way of celebrating together that includes learning how to articulate what it means to celebrate together. And what we are lamenting. And, actually, despite ourselves, because we're proving that it's not all lost, and that we can do this. But what we're lamenting is that there's a chance, it seems like there's a chance that some Grendel-like force comes and sacks the home of liberal education, right? That just deprives people of the chance to do this kind of intellectual, literary, artistic celebration together, where we articulate what it means to be human by embodying a certain kind of communal activity. So I couldn't resist that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think this is where the Song of Roland and Beowulf come in, right? That each of us has a vocation, in a certain sense, qua human, to defend that call to celebration. Beowulf and Roland die defending the right or privilege, I would say privilege and responsibility, the duty to celebrate rightly, like in truth.
this has been a very fruitful podcast. Thank you so much to both of you. This
Great
is
conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure.